we're going to assemble this lovely transparent acrylic model of a transaxle, which is a combination of a transmission, a two-speed transmission, and a differential. So the parts for these kits, for this kit, will come in several separate bags, probably labeled transmission and differential and such. It's really probably easiest to just put it all together and then sort it out, rather than trying to keep separate which parts came with which component, because they're all the same kinds of screws and nuts and everything. So the first thing to do is to lay out all of the little parts and sort them by type, because you're going to have to be able to select the right thickness, the right width, the right diameter, paying particular attention to the washers. There's very thin flexible washers here. There's these guys, which are 3 millimeters thick, about 1/8 of an inch. These guys are 5 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch. Then there's 9 millimeter, about 3/8 of an inch, and 12 millimeter, about 1/2 an inch thick. So, and each of these has their own particular purpose. There's nuts. There are 3 nuts that are different from the others. These are lock nuts. They're a little thicker, so separate them out. There's some very short, very small screws, tiny little nuts. Keep them separate. And then there's all the different lengths of screws. So at the longest end, there's this 3.5 inch threaded rod. It has no head on it on either end. Then there's 3 of the longest screws, 3 inches. Then there's 4, the next shorter ones, there's 4 of them that are all the same. And then there's one that's just a little bit shorter. So a group of 4 that are the same, then a shorter one, then another shorter one, and another shorter one. So it's 1, 2, 3, each getting a little bit shorter, and then a pair that are the same length, and then a whole group that are all 1/2 inch, quite short. So you want to get those separated out, make sure you can identify these different groups of screw lengths. And then there's just all the other parts, which we'll get to one by one. So now we're going to start sort of at the differential end of things. We need one of these blue gears and one of the 3 longest screws that have heads on them, so one of the 3-inch screws. Take the 3-inch screw, go through the hole, take one of the nuts, the regular nuts that there's the most of, and spin that on. And then using the wrench, it's probably the easiest, to tighten that, as long as you hold on to the gear and maybe the screw a little bit. You usually don't need the screwdriver on the other end to get it good and tight. Then we need one of the 9 millimeter, so the second thickest washer goes on there. And then we need this bent piece of acrylic. And this gear goes in the end, in from the inside, like that. Now we need these 2 screws that are slightly longer than the large group, and there are 2 that are the same. We're going to use those 2 screws next. Take one of those, put it through one of the side holes here, and then one of the 3 millimeter washers goes on, and one of these amber colored gears goes on. You have to sort of angle it in so the teeth engage there and slips on. And now we need one of the lock nuts. So these are similar to the other nuts, but they are slightly thicker. They have sort of a ring and a little piece of plastic, sort of plastic insert in there. We put it on the side that doesn't have the plastic insert, goes on first. That will spin on. It initially spins very easily, just like a regular nut, but then fairly soon it starts binding, and you can't turn it anymore with your finger. So at that point you need to use a wrench to hold the nut in place, and it's slightly awkward, and you need a screwdriver to turn the screw. And it takes a good bit of force. If you have a bigger screwdriver or a bigger wrench, of course, feel free to use it, but it works fine with the ones that we include with the kits. So you're going to tighten this up until the point where it's actually tight, and the gear won't turn anymore. So the gear is now stuck, it won't turn, and then back up by about a half, or maybe a little less than half a turn. So this should now wobble. It should be free to wiggle a little bit, and this should spin very freely. If it's binding at all, loosen it a little bit. Then we take the second one of those 2 screws that we got through the other side, another 3mm washer goes on there, and the other amber colored gear goes in there, and another lock nut goes on the end here. Okay, spin it on to the point where you can't hold it anymore, and then using a wrench, sort of awkwardly hold this and tighten it. Again, until it's tight, and then back up. It's really less than half a turn. It's just enough so that it is free to spin very easily, like that. Okay. Now we take the other blue gear and another one of these long 3-inch screws. Stick that through. Stick a nut on it. And tighten it down. Then the 9mm washer goes on there. And this now goes through the center hole in the very large green gear, like that. And now, it's easiest I find to hold this by the axle here, and that also keeps the gears lined up correctly. And similarly, hold this by the axle, and then put them together. And the tabs and slots will fit together. You may have to flex this very slightly to get them lined up, but it should be pretty close. And then you have to press this together and take one of the regular nuts, and you see there's these T-slots here. We want to slide a nut into one of those T-slots. And sometimes you have to push a little bit. If you find you're having to push a lot, like it just doesn't want to go in, that's because it's not rotated right. You need to rotate it so the flat sides of the nut are going in sort of parallel into the side. And it shouldn't take much force. Often they'll actually just fall right out. They fit completely loosely, which is why I'm holding it sideways like that so it doesn't fall out. And then one of the shortest screws, these 1/2-inch screws, stick it in through the other side and tighten it. You don't have to tighten these very hard, just get them nice and snug so they don't fall apart. And then, I do this holding it the other way so you can see better. Second nut into that slot. Again, it should just really slide in very easily. And another one of the short 1/2-inch screws. Okay, now we have basically the innards of the differential ready to go. I'm going to set that aside for a minute. So next we need to get the two sort of large frame components that hold this whole thing together. And it's actually possible to build pretty much any of these models as mirror images of each other. All the pieces are flat and symmetrical. So in some ways it doesn't actually matter which way you put it together. We're going to put it together in an orientation that, that matches the pictures, I guess, is what the main thing is. So taking this piece, which I think looks kind of like a square-mouthed or square-billed duck or something, it's funny, I don't know. Holding it this way, and find the 4 screws that are the second longest, the 4 that are all the same. And we're going to use 2 of those. And with the piece in this orientation in from the back, sticking out like that. Yes. Okay, then we need these 12mm washers, the longest, thickest of the washers. We'll put 2 of them on each of these screws, like that. And then find there's 2 pieces that look like this. Find one of those, stick it on there, and then 2 nuts, one on each end. Like that, and tighten it. You can pretty much use either the screwdriver or a wrench, or if you want both. You don't want to really super tighten this. If you have a big screwdriver, be careful because it could crack something. Okay, so that's one side. Now The other side, you find the same set of 3 holes. So this needs to match up like this, and this needs to go out the other direction. So if we set this one like this, we want these 2 to go that way. So we'll take the other 2 of those screws, the group of 4, and in this case they'll go this way. And then we need 4 more of these 12mm washers. Sometimes these are warped a little bit and you have to kind of push them down, but that's fine. Okay, 4 of those, and the second one of these, and 2 nuts. And then tighten again. Okay, now we have the framework ready to go, and we are going to mount this. And so this goes with the green gear facing the less interesting of the 2 sides. So we take a 9mm washer, second thickest, slip it on there, and then slide this through both of those holes. And then, kind of holding this all together, we take another 9mm washer, slip it through there, and that through there. Now this, it's very wobbly, but it will sort of hold up. If these gears don't spin very easily when it's kind of held square and in the opposite direction, I'm pulling out on the gears also to keep them in the right position. If it's not spinning very easily, it's probably because the teeth are off by 1, and you may need to take it apart and fix that because it won't work right. Okay. Okay, so now we're ready to start working on the transmission portion of things. So we'll find these 2 pieces. They are identical, doesn't matter which one goes where. And the first one is going to go here. So there's a side that is just sort of 2 square pieces, and there's one that's angled. We're going to take the one that is just 2 square pieces, and it goes through those tabs there, and on the back side through 2 tabs on that side. And again, it'll sort of hold itself together just long enough for us to slip a nut in here. And then get the screw in. Of course, it's all falling apart now. Okay, so I've got 1 nut in there, and I notice I didn't tighten it. I just sort of screwed it in, just enough so it doesn't actually fall apart. That's kind of important for later. And now put the next nut in there, and screw. Again, just enough that it doesn't fall apart. We're not even finger tight, just like intentionally loose. And then a nut on the top here, and a screw. Turn just a little bit in. I'm actually going to back this one out a bit so this can move a lot. Okay, so we'll see why it needs to move in a minute, but right now we're going to set it aside because next we need to build a couple of sub-assemblies of the transmission. The first one we'll do is the output drive shaft, which is this longest screw, which has no head on either end. And we take a nut, spin it on one end. You may have to turn a little bit hard because they're ground and it should be okay, but you might have to work a little bit to get the nut on. And then you see these 3 unusual washers. They have round holes, but they're square on the outside. So put one on and the second one. And we're actually at this point just using these as spacers to measure where this nut should go. So we want to turn it so that the end of the shaft is is flush. In other words, we have two washer heights of shaft on this side of the nut. And then we can take these off. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you're going to make a mistake in one way or another, have this a little shorter. So maybe just move this nut a little bit in that direction. But it's, there's a fair amount of play available. Okay, and then now we flip it around, and holding this nut so that it doesn't move, put all three of these washers on, like that. And then this piece of square tube slides on, and the square nuts go right through that square plastic. So this now makes a square shaft that is nicely centered on the round shaft. And we take another nut, and we find this lovely little gear, two green gears attached to a transparent disc. And that slides onto the square shaft. And we put the nut back. How many times I forgot to put that thing on? Okay, then tighten it again. And 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn past finger tight. Maybe even a whole turn. Good and tight. Okay, so now this should slide very easily. For any reason it's binding, you may have some little burr or something in there. It needs to be cleaned off. It needs to be able to slide very smoothly. Okay, so that's sub-assembly number 1. Next, we're going to assemble the shift lever and the sort of armature that moves that clutch plate. So there's 2 pieces like this, and there's 3 pieces that have this shape. There's a thick one, 3mm thick one, and 2 very thin flexible ones. We'll start with one of the big piece and one of the flexible pieces. So notice this side, there's one side that's longer than the other. Have the longer side down, and find the 2 little screws, the 2 tiniest, smaller diameter screws. Those 2 go in from behind, like that. And then this little flexible piece, so there's 2 ways it could go. It could go this way or it could go this way. And we want to put it on in the orientation where the curvature of the cutout there matches the curve here. If you put it the other way, it'll be at a funny angle and it won't look right. These should be sort of concentric circles. So one flexible piece, and then the thicker piece, again, oriented so that it matches up the curvature, and then the second thin piece goes on, and then the second one of these with, again, the longer piece facing down goes onto the 2 screws. And then the 2 tiny little nuts. What I like to do is just sort of press it down so the screw actually comes out the other side, hold it in place, and then get the screwdriver in and tighten it, and the screw will pick up and go in through the nut. Take the other nut, put it in here, and we actually, so at this point we don't want to tighten these. We want to get them just finger tight. Actually tighten that too much, so back it up. So it still can sort of wiggle around a little bit. And at that stage we take one of the bigger nuts, and you see there's a slot that goes all the way through. We want to slide that nut in, and here you will have to push a little bit, and you may even have to use a screwdriver. And you want to get it centered so that it is exactly in the middle. You can use the screwdriver here to sort of orient the hole and move it back and forth until it's exactly centered in the middle here. And then sort of hold this down on a flat surface to keep it squared up, and tighten these screws. And once you get them mostly tight, you can take it off and really tighten them down. So this should now be sort of nice and square, set straight with a nut in the middle. Then we find this piece, which has a slot, and the slot is not quite in the center. So we want the slot to be below center. It's symmetrical in this direction, but we want it lower than the middle. And then with this longer side facing down, put them together like that. Set it down, and find the of the remaining screws, the longest one, it's not the really long one. So this, of the group of three that are each a little bit longer, it's the longest of those three. Take that and put a nut on it and spin it about halfway down. And then find this little small rectangle with a hole in it. Screw goes through there. And then it goes, it goes through that hole, through the slot, and then into that nut that's down in that piece of plastic. And again, the orientation is that this slot is to the lower part of it's below the middle here, and this is the longer side together. Okay, now looking at it from the side, we want to screw this screw in. You can see it coming out past the nut, and we don't want it to be sort of tight up against the plastic. We want to back it up so that it's fully engaged in the nut, but not sticking out beyond the nut. That's just to avoid putting stress on the plastic and possibly cracking it. Okay, so now with this, like this, and holding the screw in place, we spin the nut down so that the nut is tight against that rectangle. And then get a wrench and tighten this nut. Now it's okay if the screw turns a little bit, it probably will, because we've left some room for it to continue on into the nut without hitting the plastic. So trying to keep all these pieces square, tighten this. Don't overdo it, but it can be nice and tight. If this is not sliding smoothly, it's possible that you tighten this too much. It's possible that this is not square. See if you can loosen things and get this to be able to slide very freely like that. Okay, so that's the second subassembly. Okay, now we're going to start on the third subassembly for the transmission, which is made out of these two main parts. This one you'll notice is engraved with H and L for high and low gear. We want those that engraving to be on the top surface so that the letters look right side up and you can sort of feel that it's on that side. And it goes like that in this piece. And it takes two nuts and two screws to hold these two pieces together. Put a nut in there and one of the shortest screws. All these T-joints always use the shortest screw. Tighten that. Then put the other nut in. Another screw. And push this down and tighten that. So we've got that. Then we want to take the longest of the remaining not super long screws. This one goes through that hole and put a nut on it. This we want to get nice and tight. You can use both the screwdriver and the wrench to get it nice and tight. And now we come to the high stakes portion of the assembly video, where we introduce a spring. So this spring goes on the screw, and then we take one of the 3mm washers, the thinnest of the substantial washers, and push it on. Now if I were to let go, we would never find this washer or the spring ever again. It would be off somewhere in a corner, so you want to be very careful to keep it compressed and push it down about halfway down the screw, and don't let go. And then we find the shifter. This is the shift lever. It goes through that slot and then up and over the screw. At this point you can hold this and let go of the spring down there, and this will hold it in place. But it's not safe until we take the last of the lock nuts. So this is one of the nuts that has the little plastic insert, and we spin it on, the plastic side up, spin it on until it stops wanting to turn. And at this point we need to use the wrench to tighten it, and we're going to keep tightening it until this green plastic is roughly parallel with that piece of plastic. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to get it sort of by eye to be basically parallel. A little bit more. And that'll be the point at which the nut is pretty much entirely on the screw, but not much farther. Okay, so this is the shift lever. You can see how it works. The spring presses it in place, and to shift it you can't just push, you have to go in and across and out, just like a real shifter. Okay, so these are all the sub-assemblies. Now we come to the exciting part where we can actually put this all together. So we go back to this, and we take the output shaft, and it's going to go in this orientation, and you can sort of figure out which gear goes where by the fact that this way is supposed to be high gear, which means this side of the output shaft needs to have the small gear. So there are these lovely blue with pink tooth wheel attached gears. The small one goes here on the left, and it goes with the pink thing facing in, because the pink is going to engage with the green here. These are like clutch plates. They go together. And then the big one that has the pink attached goes on that side. And then we take a 5mm washer. So they're twice as thick as the thinner of those washers. Goes on here. And this now goes in through the bottom hole of this wall here. And it will just kind of sit here. This is all wobbly, but that's okay. It's just going to hang together. Next we take, actually we can put this next wall on next, because that's sort of different ways of doing it, but this is maybe the easier way. So next we take another of the 5mm washers, stick that on the end of that shaft, and then this is why we left these screws loose. So put the drive shaft through the output shaft, and then we sort of spread these two out just enough to let that fit in, and those tabs engage. And if these were tight, then you'd have to bend that too much and they might crack. Okay, so at this point we want to check for play. So this wobbles a little bit, and we need there to be free play here. It needs to be able to wobble back and forth, but not too much. And this is sort of too much. So to fix that, we take this back out again. And because the thickness of acrylic is not completely consistent, yours may or may not have a different amount of wobble in it, or play. That's what these very thin washers here are for. They're much thinner than the 3mm ones. They sort of look, they're actually about 1/2 millimeter, very thin. And just based on how that feels, I think one washer is probably about right. Your model might need none, or it might need 2 or even 3. So we can put one of those on, and then put that back through the hole, back in the tabs, and second set of tabs. There, okay. And now, yeah, so this is good. It has just a little bit of play in it, and that's the way it should be. Okay, so now we can tighten these screws. Tighten that, and tighten this. And then we're going to put nuts and screws in there to get that fastened together. So put 1, 2, 3 nuts. Now, as those of you who are mechanically inclined will probably know, anytime you're putting together a real thing, like the thing made of metal with multiple screws like this, you always want to sort of get them all in first, and then finger tighten them all to get everything snugged into place, and then go around in a pattern, alternately tightening one, and then go to the opposite side, have sort of star pattern or whatever, to relieve stress and to make sure they're all equally tight. None of that is necessary with this acrylic, because the acrylic is flexible enough and the model has enough play in everywhere that you don't actually have to follow those sort of good mechanics practices of tightening the screws in the right order. Okay, so now we've got that pretty good set of things done. Next we can put this last frame on, piece of the frame. it can actually go either way, but if you put it this way, then the Mechanical Gifts logo will be facing out, and it will look nice. Put that on, and one nut, one screw. And then there's this one, which is a little awkward to get in, but not too bad. As long as you don't wait until too late in the assembly sequence to put that nut in, you'll be okay. Now we take the longest screw, the long one that does still have a head on it, and we're going to be sort of threading this through and adding gears to it as it goes. So next, we might as well attach the output gear. This is what makes this a transaxle rather than just a transmission and a differential, is the fact that the drive gear of the differential is attached directly to the shaft of the transmission. So, to attach that gear, we need to get a nut onto the end of this output shaft from the transmission, which you actually can't do by turning the gears because the transmission is not in gear, but you can do it by turning this disc in the middle, sort of hold the nut in place and spin the shaft. That's a good way of getting it started. And back it up farther than it needs to be, and then get this gear on. Now, the correct position for this gear is just right at the very end of the large gear. So, not back here. It will not turn smoothly. You want to back it up so that the teeth, just the tips of the teeth, are engaging each other. So spin this nut until the point where it seems like it's just those tips are engaging, and then put another nut on. Really very awkward sometimes in here. Okay, so now let's just sort of test, finger tighten these and see. So this gear is a little bit too far in, so I'll move that nut and this nut. I'm going to use the wrench to reach in there and spin that. And it's still a little farther. Just that looks good. So they're like the ends of the teeth are just engaging like that. And then we can use the two wrenches to tighten that gear on. And then try again and see how it spins. It should spin very easily. If it's grinding and binding here, it's probably because these gears are too close to each other. And then loosen and back up that nut a little bit. All right, now we can install the shifting mechanism. So we take this sub-assembly, the longer side goes down, and you want to take this sort of calipers, and they go on either side of that disc in the middle and snap into place over the tabs there. And then we want to put a nut here, and a nut here, and two screws. Okay, this can now shift the transmission. Now we take this shift lever thing, and it goes on, the forks of the shift lever go over that screw, on either side of the screw, and it also slips into place over its tabs. And put a nut, second nut, screw, and screw. Tighten it. Okay, just one more thing, which is to put the crank on. To put the crank on, we have to make the crank first. So we have this piece of the crank. Here I'm going to show how to add this electric motor kit to an existing transaxle model. So assuming that you have built the whole model with a crank on it, as illustrated in the video for assembling this model, you need to sort of back off, or if you're seeing this video first, you'll know not to put these parts together initially. What I've done is I've taken out the main drive shaft here, which if you've already built it, you can just take all the nuts off, loosen everything, back this out. You'll end up with these 2 gears and a bunch of nuts and washers and things. So this is the point at which we're going to start installing the electrification kit. So these are the parts that come with the motor kit, particularly these 2 2-inch screws. And the reason we had to take all these gears out is so that we can get these screws in from behind. Now you can actually install this either way. You can put the motor on this side, replacing the crank, or you can put it on this side. It will not interfere with the differential, although it does obscure the view a little bit. If you put it on this side, you can actually have the motor and the crank at the same time. But we're going to put it on this side because it's sort of a little easier to see what's going on. But there are mounting holes on both of these, so you can do it either way. So we take this screw, put it in from the inside, and in from the inside. These are the 2 outer holes that are on either side of the hole that the drive shaft goes through. Then we take a nut and spin the nut on all the way down, and spin all the way down this one too. And I'm going to use a wrench holding onto the screw. Tighten that. And tighten that. These are the mounts that will hold the electric motor bracket. Okay, now we can put back the stuff that we had to take apart earlier. So this is the 3-inch screw that was here. It goes in from this side. So we start by pushing it through. I just want to do it this way. Put it through a little bit and find a 3mm washer that came with the kit. Slides on the end there. Maybe I'll do it this way. Then a nut. Spin that on. And then, because the big gear is down there, we need the small gear. Small gear first. Then another nut. Spin that on, and we can now back this one up a little farther and back this up some. Then a second or third nut goes on here. Back this one up somewhat. Then the large gear goes on there, and another nut goes on here. At this point, I'm going to sort of spin everything back a little bit farther, but not too far. I went a little too far because we have to be able to get a 3mm washer onto the end of that screw. That. Now it can go through the hole there. So the sequence is 3mm washer, nut, 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 washer, and then out the other side. And now we can spin all of these back progressively to their final positions. Slide the gears so you get your finger in. They can go farther. Get this one into position first. So it would go to the point where it's tight and this is not wobbling anymore, and then back up maybe almost a whole turn until there is some, not quite that far, there's some wobble here. This needs to be nice and loose. Then slide this gear down and sort of holding the gear in place here, that will clamp both the nut and the shaft and let you turn this nut without turning anything else. Get that sort of finger tight. And now back this one up to get it out of the way, and move this one forwards in that direction until it's tight, and there's again no wobble here. And at that point, back it up by half a turn or so that there's just a bit of wobble here. Then slide that gear over there, hold it in place, and spin that nut to be finger tight. And try to get these tightened up again. Okay, check for play, and then we can use 2 wrenches on each of the gears to get these tight. Okay, and then check again for play. Should be just a little bit of wobble. If it's tight, if it doesn't spin very freely, loosen one of these, back it up, and try again. Okay, but that's good. So, next we put the coupler, the motor coupler on. This has
Cut.
break. Now we're ready to start reassembling the drive shaft here that we took apart in order to get these screws in. Now originally, if you have a crank on here, the screw goes this way with the head on the back side, but with the electric motor kit it needs to go the opposite direction. So we take the 3-inch screw that came from this kit, and we take this coupler, this is the sort of motor coupler that's going to fit together with the electric motor, and it has a flat side and a side with the deep indentations on it. Put the screw in through the indentation side so the head actually ends up buried down inside the plastic. And spin the nut all the way down on that. And then we want to tighten this about as tight as we can get it, because the motor has to be able to drive this without coming loose. Okay, so this is now going to go through here like that, but we need to get it the right distance through. We'll start with a 5mm washer, goes through there, and we can't just stick it all the way through because we have to get all the nuts and gears on as we're going. So the first thing is a 3mm washer, goes on there, and then a nut. And it's easier to sort of turn the shaft to get the nut started. And then the larger of the 2 gears, it's going to mesh with that smaller gear down there, slides on. Then another nut, spin that on, and another nut, so 2 nuts in a row. Okay, now we need to kind of spin these a little farther along, but not too far, because we still have to be able to slide the smaller gear and another nut. And another 3mm washer goes out there, and now we can stick it the rest of the way through. So now everything should, be in the right order. 3mm washer, nut, gear, nut, nut, gear, nut, washer. And now we can spin these things down into place. So we start with this one on the far right, spin it to the point where it stops and this is tight and not wobbly, and then back up by half a turn or a little more. So there's a bit of play in here. That's a bit too much. There's a bit of play there. Then move that gear in place and use your finger to sort of clamp the gear that will hold both the shaft and the nut. Keep it from spinning while we spin this nut up into place. So that's against there. And now we sort of back this one up just in order to get this gear out of the way, and spin this nut in the other direction until it's tight up against this wall, and there's again no play here. Tight, and then back up by about a half a turn, a little less, maybe a quarter or 3/8 of a turn, till there's just a bit of wobble there. Slide that gear into place, hold it, and spin this, get that thing back tightened up, check for a bit of play, and then using 2 wrenches, tighten both of these gears. Nice and tight, and get this nice and tight. Okay, and then check again for play. That's just perfect. Just a bit of click, clack, back and forth, and it should of course spin very freely like that. Okay, now we're ready to mount the motor. We take a nut here, spin it a good ways down, and this down. Okay, actually first we need to mount the battery pack. So we open up the battery pack, and you'll see there's a little hole drilled through there, and there's these tiny screws, a tiny screw and a tiny nut that came with the kit. You need to get this screw in from the inside, which is tricky. So stick it on the end of the screwdriver, hold it in place just with the tip of your finger, and use that to guide it through the hole and out the front. And then you might as well just keep the screwdriver there to hold it in place. So it's actually possible to build these kits in mirror image orientation, and if you've done that, that's fine. It works just as well. It has no preference for one way or the other, but it does matter which side the battery will mount on, and you'll find that there's little holes, one on each side, so that it works either way. And you want to put it on the side where when you put that screw through that little hole, the switch is sticking out on this side where you can get to it, rather than pushed up against the plastic where you can't get to it. So this is the way it's going to go. And now you need to get a nut onto the end of that screw, which may be easier said than done depending on which orientation you built the thing in. So what I do is just slide the nut along the surface, back the screw out till it's flush, so I can slide the nut over the hole, and then push the screw in and tighten it. And believe me, it's not that easy the first time, but I've done this quite a few times. So then once it's oriented correctly, adjusted right, you can tighten it, and that's now holding the batteries in place. Leave the cover off for now. Okay, now we take the motor. It will come pre-assembled and soldered like this, and put the wires through the slot in this motor mounting bracket, and then slide the motor. There's flats there, so it'll only go in one way, like that. Slide it in, and it should have a little bit of friction. Then slide it onto these 2 screws and push it in place. You want to sort of push it all the way so that well, let's see. So you want to have it so that when the motor is pushed as far back as it will go in the bracket, there's a bit of a gap there, a couple of millimeters or 1/8 of an inch maybe of gap. Back these nuts up to that point. To the point where there's just sort of a comfortable amount of gap there. It doesn't have to be much. And then put 2 more nuts on the outside. Okay, now you want to check the alignment of this motor, because depending on where these nuts are, they can tip a little bit. So try to get it squared up so that when you slide it in, these 2 couplers engage with each other, and you want them to be sort of in line with each other. You can adjust that a little bit. Then tighten these nuts with a wrench. And at this point, all you have to do is put the batteries in. The kit comes with batteries. Slip them in the correct orientation, which is marked in the battery case. Put the case cover on, and this is now ready to go. So switch it on, and here we go. So this is in low gear, but we can switch it to neutral, this will stop, or high gear, and it takes off. We can also disengage the motor if you want by just pulling it back like that. And that lets you spin it manually if you like. Stick it back in. This lets you quite easily see how the differential works. Stop one gear and the other one keeps going. An important property of this motor is that it's very small and it's not very strong at all. So if you stick your fingers into the gears here, or find some place in here where they'll pinch, it just stops. It doesn't hurt in the slightest. You can't hurt yourself on these gears. So there you go. Low gear, high gear. So you shift it from this angle, high gear, low gear.